What happens when beloved childhood cartoons are deemed too dangerous to show again? For decades, Warner Brothers quietly locked away some of its most controversial Looney Tunes shorts. Films once celebrated for their artistry, later buried for what they revealed about America's past. These are the cartoons history tried to forget, and the reasons why are deeply unsettling. Number 10. Clean Pastures, 1937. Released during the height of Warner Brothers' early experimentation, Clean Pastures was conceived as a playful satire of spiritual morality tales, popular in the 1930s. The cartoon imagines heaven and hell as rival nightclubs, each competing for souls through jazz, swing, and big band spectacle. At the time, it was considered daring and modern, blending popular African-American musical styles with irreverent humor. But embedded within its energetic animation is a visual language that would later become impossible to ignore. The characters were drawn using exaggerated racial caricatures common in early Hollywood animation, designs that reflected industry norms rather than individual malice, yet carried harmful implications. What once passed as musical parody slowly came to be recognized as something more troubling. By the late 1960s, as television syndication expanded Looney Tunes into daily children's programming, Clean Pastures became increasingly controversial. Warner Brothers executives recognized that the cartoon's imagery could no longer be contextualized safely for young audiences. Rather than edit it, the studio chose complete removal. What makes Clean Pastures especially significant is how it reveals animation's early dependency on caricature as shorthand. The short is often cited by historians as a transitional work, technically inventive, musically influential, but ethically outdated. It represents a moment when animation had not yet separated artistic homage from harmful representation. Number 9. Sunday Go to Meetin Time, 1936. Sunday Go to Meetin Time is often regarded as one of the darkest cartoons Warner Brothers ever produced. Framed as a moral fable, the story follows a man tempted away from church, only to face terrifying supernatural punishment for his choices. Unlike other Looney Tunes shorts, comedy here takes a back seat to dread. The animation is nightmarish. Shadows stretch unnaturally. Demonic imagery dominates the screen. The cartoon's final act descends into a surreal hellscape that borders on horror rather than humor. Even by 1930s standards, the short was unsettling. Compounding this atmosphere were visual stereotypes that reflected the era's deeply ingrained racial assumptions. While the cartoon was not unique in this regard, its grim tone amplified the discomfort. What might have been dismissed as exaggerated fantasy elsewhere became disturbing when paired with moral condemnation and fear-based storytelling. When Warner Brothers reviewed its catalog decades later, Sunday Go to Meetin Time stood out not just for its imagery, but for its emotional impact. Executives reportedly considered it inappropriate for children regardless of cultural context. Unlike other banned shorts, this one frightened as much as it offended. As a result, the cartoon was quietly removed from circulation. It never appeared in television packages or home video collections. Today, it is discussed as an anomaly, a Looney Tunes short that abandoned laughter in favor of punishment. For historians, it remains a chilling reminder of animation's experimental years, when studios were still deciding what cartoons were meant to be. Number 8. Hittin the Trail for Hallelujah Land, 1931, one of Warner Brothers' earliest sound-era cartoons. Hittin the Trail for Hallelujah Land predates the fully formed Looney Tunes identity. At the time, the studio was competing fiercely with Disney and other animation houses, often relying on popular tropes rather than original characters. The cartoon is structured around a musical journey filled with exaggerated figures and broad humor intended to appeal to mass audiences of the early 1930s. What audiences accepted then, however, quickly became indefensible as social awareness evolved. The designs and gags in Hittin the Trail for Hallelujah Land are almost entirely built from racial stereotypes that Hollywood had normalized. Unlike later shorts where offensive elements are interwoven with iconic characters, this cartoon offers little else to contextualize or soften its impact. As Looney Tunes gained new life on television in the post-war era, Warner Brothers faced a dilemma. Some cartoons could be edited, others could be contextualized. This one could not. Its identity was inseparable from imagery that no longer aligned with the studio's public-facing values. Rather than risk controversy, the cartoon was removed from circulation entirely. It disappeared quietly, long before public debate could form around it. Today, Hittin the Trail for Hallelujah Land is remembered not for innovation, but as a historical marker, a reminder of how early sound animation leaned heavily on cultural shortcuts that later generations would reject. Number 7. The Isle of Pingo Pongo. 1938. The Isle of Pingo Pongo was produced during a period when Warner Brothers was experimenting heavily with musical travelogues and exoticized fantasy settings. On the surface, the cartoon presents itself as a lively musical revue filled with rhythmic performances, surreal landscapes, and exaggerated motion designed to synchronize with swing-era soundtracks. At the time of its release, audiences viewed it as another fast-paced novelty cartoon, one more entry in a crowded slate of Merry Melodies shorts meant to entertain rather than endure. However, the cartoon's entire premise is built on caricature masquerading as cultural exploration. The island setting becomes an excuse for distorted depictions that reduce entire peoples and cultures into visual jokes. Unlike later Looney Tunes shorts, where problematic elements appear alongside iconic characters or slapstick chaos, the Isle of Pingo Pongo offers little narrative distraction from its imagery. The stereotypes are not incidental, they are the cartoon's foundation. When Warner Brothers began reassessing its library for television distribution in the mid-20th century, this short stood out immediately. There was no practical way to edit or reframe it without dismantling the cartoon entirely. As cultural standards shifted, the studio opted for removal rather than revision. Today, the Isle of Pingo Pongo survives mainly as a reference point in animation scholarship, cited as an example of how musical ambition and artistic energy were often undermined by deeply flawed representation. Number 6. Jungle Jitters. 1938. Released in the same year as several other now-suppressed shorts, Jungle Jitters reflects Warner Brothers' fascination with jungle-themed cartoons during the late 1930s. These settings allowed animators to push exaggeration to extremes, elastic motion, chaotic pacing, and surreal sight gags, while relying on familiar adventure tropes borrowed from pulp fiction and colonial-era storytelling. To contemporary audiences, the cartoon likely felt energetic and visually inventive, another fast-moving entry in the studio's growing catalog. But Jungle Jitters is almost entirely constructed from racial caricature. The characters are defined not by personality or narrative function, but by distorted physical traits and mannerisms that were considered acceptable shorthand at the time. There is no central Looney Tunes star to offset the imagery, no clever subversion or irony to complicate its message. The cartoon presents its worldview plainly and without self-awareness. As Warner Brothers transitioned its shorts to children's television programming decades later, Jungle Jitters became indefensible. Executives recognized that even with disclaimers, the cartoon's content would be harmful rather than educational. Unlike borderline cases, this one offered no redeeming contextual value for general audiences. It was quietly withdrawn and never restored. Today, it stands as a stark reminder of how early animation often mirrored the prejudices of the culture that produced it, without resistance or reflection. Number 5. Goldilocks and the Jivin Bears. 1944. At first glance, Goldilocks and the Jivin Bears appears more sophisticated than many earlier banned shorts. Released during World War II, the cartoon showcases Warner Brothers' increasing technical confidence with fluid animation, strong musical timing, and a nightclub setting that reflects the era's fascination with swing culture. The fairy tale parody format gives the short a sense of structure and familiarity, making it one of the more polished entries later removed from circulation. Yet beneath its stylish surface lies a reliance on exaggerated racial imagery that ultimately sealed its fate. The nightclub environment becomes a framework for caricature rather than character development. While the animation is energetic and the pacing sharp, the cartoon's humor depends heavily on visual stereotypes that grew increasingly uncomfortable as decades passed. When Warner Brothers evaluated which cartoons could remain part of its television packages, Goldilocks and the Jivin bears posed a difficult dilemma. Unlike some earlier shorts, it contained genuine artistic merit, but the studio ultimately concluded that presentation quality could not outweigh representational harm. The cartoon was withdrawn alongside more overtly offensive titles. Today, it is often cited as one of the most conflicted examples among the locked-away shorts, technically impressive, culturally influential, yet permanently sidelined. It illustrates how even well-crafted animation can become historically trapped by the assumptions of its time. Number 4. Angel Puss, 1944. Angel Puss occupies a strange and uncomfortable position within the Looney Tunes legacy because it pairs a familiar slapstick premise with imagery that ultimately overwhelmed everything else the cartoon attempted to do. Directed by Chuck Jones, the short follows a simple gag-driven storyline involving a boy who believes he has killed a cat, only to be haunted by its supposed ghost. Structurally, the cartoon is classic Warner Brothers. Fast pacing, escalating paranoia, and visual exaggeration designed to amplify fear and comedy simultaneously. However, the human character at the center of the cartoon was rendered using racial caricature that reflected industry norms rather than narrative necessity. Unlike other banned shorts, where offensive depictions are central to the premise, Angel Puss demonstrates how casually such imagery could be embedded into otherwise standard cartoons. The character design serves no thematic purpose beyond convention, yet it becomes impossible to separate from the viewing experience. When Warner Brothers later reviewed its catalog for television syndication, Angel Puss proved especially disappointing for historians. The cartoon itself could have survived intact with minimal edits if not for its character depiction. Instead, it joined the locked-away titles, removed entirely rather than partially altered. Today, it is often discussed as an example of squandered creative potential, an otherwise solid cartoon undone by assumptions no longer defensible. Number 3. Pan Alleycats, 1943. Among the most visually ambitious cartoons Warner Brothers ever produced, Pan Alleycats is frequently cited as a masterpiece of surreal animation. Directed by Bob Clampett, the short abandons conventional narrative structure in favor of a dreamlike jazz fantasia inspired by the music and persona of Fats Waller. Pianos melt. Cityscapes transform. Rhythm dictates reality. From an animation standpoint, the cartoon represents Warner Brothers at the height of its experimental confidence, yet its brilliance is inseparable from imagery that ultimately led to its suppression. The cartoon's caricatures, while intended as musical homage within the context of 1940s pop culture, rely on exaggerated visual language that later generations would view as offensive rather than celebratory. What was once framed as admiration through imitation became difficult to justify as cultural understanding deepened. Warner Brothers faced significant internal debate over Pan Alleycats because of its undeniable artistic importance. Ultimately, the studio determined that technical achievement could not excuse content that risked harm or misinterpretation. The cartoon was withdrawn and never reinstated, despite its influence on later animators. Today, it remains one of the most discussed banned shorts precisely because of this contradiction, an animation triumph permanently sidelined by the worldview that shaped it. Number 2. All This and Rabbit Stew, 1941. All This and Rabbit Stew is notable for one reason above all others. It features Bugs Bunny, Warner Brothers' most recognizable and enduring star. The cartoon follows a familiar hunting setup, with Bugs facing off against a slow-witted antagonist. Structurally, it aligns perfectly with classic Looney Tunes comedy, using timing, verbal misdirection, and physical humor that defined Bugs' appeal. The problem lies entirely in the depiction of the hunter. Designed using racial stereotypes common in early Hollywood, the character became increasingly indefensible as Bugs Bunny transitioned into a children's television icon. What might have once been dismissed as exaggerated comedy became impossible to contextualize alongside Bugs's growing role as a global symbol of Warner Brothers. This placed All This and Rabbit Stew in a uniquely uncomfortable position. The studio could not remove Bugs Bunny from the cartoon, nor could it edit the character without dismantling the premise. Faced with this dilemma, Warner Brothers chose removal. The cartoon's absence from official collections is particularly striking given Bugs's prominence. It serves as a reminder that even flagship characters were not immune to the consequences of the era that created them. The cartoon remains locked away, discussed rather than displayed. Number 1. Coal Black and the Sebben Dwarfs, 1943. Coal Black and the Sebben Dwarfs is widely regarded as the most famous and controversial Looney Tunes short ever locked away by Warner Brothers, directed by Bob Clampett. The cartoon was conceived as a high-energy jazz parody of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, infused with swing-era music, explosive animation, and a relentless pace that pushed the medium forward. From a purely technical standpoint, the short is often described by animation historians as one of the most fluid and expressive cartoons of its era. The timing is impeccable. The character movement is bold and elastic. The visual rhythm mirrors jazz improvisation in a way few animated films had ever attempted. Yet that same cartoon also represents the clearest example of how artistic innovation and cultural harm became intertwined during animation's golden age. The characters are built entirely around exaggerated racial caricatures that were normalized in Hollywood at the time, but later recognized as deeply offensive. Unlike other banned shorts where stereotypes exist alongside broader narratives, Coal Black and the Seven Dwarfs places them at the very center of its identity. The imagery cannot be separated from the cartoon's style, tone, or humor. By the late 1960s, Warner Brothers had little choice. The cartoon's reputation had grown too controversial to defend, regardless of its artistic achievements. It was permanently removed from television syndication and excluded from home video releases. Today, it exists primarily as a case study in contradiction, hailed by animators for its craft, condemned for its content, and locked away as a reminder that technical brilliance does not absolve cultural responsibility. These cartoons were never erased because they were forgotten. They were hidden because they revealed too much about their era, their industry, and the assumptions once taken for granted. Locked away for decades, they now exist as historical evidence, reminding us that animation history is as complicated as it is entertaining.